A millionaire witnesses his daughter being ignored as she tries to protect the only person who truly understands her, the housemaid. The new fiancée, cold and arrogant, throws away the necklace the girl lovingly made. That gesture awakens something in the father he had ignored for a long time, and from that moment on, he decides to uncover everything that is being destroyed inside his own home. The morning light filtered through the crystal windows of the Wellington mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, casting long shadows across the marble floors. 7-year-old Sophie Wellington pressed her small face against the cool glass, watching her father Richard hurry toward his silver Mercedes in the circular driveway. His phone was already pressed to his ear, his voice carrying the familiar tone of business urgency that had become the soundtrack of their home since her mother had passed away 2 years ago. "Sophie, sweetheart, come have your breakfast." Margaret Thompson's warm voice drifted from the kitchen, carrying with it the comforting aroma of fresh pancakes and maple syrup. The 50-year-old governess had been with the family for 3 years, arriving 6 months after the tragic accident that had claimed Sophie's mother. With her gentle grey eyes and patient smile, Margaret had become the steady presence that held their fractured household together. Sophie's bare feet padded across the hardwood floors as she made her way to the breakfast nook, where Margaret had already prepared her favourite Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes. The governess hummed softly while arranging fresh strawberries into a smiley face on top of the golden stack, her movements filled with the kind of maternal care that seemed to come naturally to her. "Daddy left early again," Sophie observed quietly, climbing onto the cushioned chair that Margaret had specifically chosen in her favourite shade of purple. Margaret's expression softened as she poured fresh orange juice into Sophie's special glass, the one decorated with dancing butterflies that had been a gift from her mother. "Your father works very hard to take care of us, darling, but you know what? Today is special because we're going to start working on something wonderful together." Sophie's eyes brightened with curiosity as she took a bite of her pancake. Margaret had a way of turning ordinary days into adventures, whether they were baking cookies, tending to the small garden behind the kitchen, or reading stories in the cozy reading nook they had created in Sophie's bedroom. "What kind of something wonderful?" Sophie asked, syrup glistening on her lips. Margaret reached into the pocket of her floral apron and produced a small velvet pouch. From inside, she drew out an assortment of colourful beads, each one catching the morning light like tiny jewels. There were deep blues like the ocean, warm yellows like sunshine, soft pinks like cotton candy, and emerald greens like the leaves in their garden. "I thought we could make friendship necklaces," Margaret explained, settling into the chair beside Sophie. "Each colour can represent something special between us. The blue for trust, yellow for happiness, pink for love, and green for hope." Sophie's face lit up with excitement as she reached for the beads, her small fingers examining each one carefully. "Can we make one for Daddy too?" "Of course, sweetheart. We'll make one for your father, one for you, and one for me. It'll be our special way of staying connected no matter what happens." As they worked together after breakfast, stringing the colourful beads onto thin cord, Sophie chattered about everything and nothing. She told Margaret about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian like Dr. Harrison, who took care of their neighbour's golden retriever, and about the story she was writing about a princess who could talk to animals. Margaret listened intently, asking questions and offering encouragement, her own fingers working steadily on a delicate pattern of alternating colours. This was their time, these quiet moments when the house felt like a real home instead of just a beautiful but empty showcase. The peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of heels clicking against marble. Victoria Sterling appeared in the doorway of the breakfast nook, her platinum blonde hair styled in a perfect chignon, her emerald eyes surveying the scene with barely concealed disapproval. She wore a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her smile was as cold and polished as the diamonds adorning her ears. "Richard didn't mention you'd be doing arts and crafts in the kitchen," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of honeyed sweetness that somehow managed to sound like a criticism. Margaret immediately began gathering the beads, her movements suddenly tense. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. Sophie finished her breakfast and I thought—" "It's quite all right," Victoria interrupted, though her tone suggested otherwise. She moved closer to examine their work, her manicured fingers picking up one of Sophie's partially completed necklaces. How quaint. Though I do think Sophie should be focusing more on her piano lessons and French tutoring. After all, she'll need proper accomplishments for her future. Sophie's small hands instinctively reached for her necklace, but Victoria held it just out of reach, examining it as if it were some curious artifact. These colors are rather loud, aren't they? Perhaps something more subtle would be appropriate. Sophie chose them herself, Margaret said quietly, her protective instincts clearly stirring. She's very creative. Victoria's laugh was like the tinkling of expensive wind chimes, beautiful but somehow hollow. Of course, well, I'm sure you both have more important things to attend to. Sophie, darling, I've arranged for Madame Dubois to come this afternoon for an extra French lesson. We simply must improve your pronunciation. With that, Victoria placed the necklace on the counter and glided away, leaving behind the subtle scent of her expensive perfume and an atmosphere that felt suddenly colder. Margaret and Sophie returned to their beadwork in companionable silence, but the joy had gone out of the morning. Sophie's movements became more careful, more hesitant, as if she were afraid her creation might somehow be found wanting again. Over the following days, their secret project continued. They worked on the necklaces during stolen moments, when Victoria was out shopping or attending one of her charitable committee meetings. Sophie poured her whole heart into the endeavor, carefully selecting each bead and thinking about what it represented. "This pink one is for all the times you read me bedtime stories," Sophie whispered one afternoon as they sat in the garden, the late summer sun warming their faces. "And this blue one is for when you held me during the thunderstorm last month." Margaret's eyes grew misty as she watched Sophie's concentration, the little girl's tongue peeking out slightly as she focused on threading a particularly stubborn bead. "And what about this yellow one, sweetheart?" "That's for your laugh," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "It sounds like sunshine." When Sophie finally finished Margaret's necklace, it was a beautiful creation of carefully chosen colors, each bead representing a shared memory, a moment of love, a promise of connection. She planned to give it to Margaret as a surprise, wrapping it carefully in tissue paper and hiding it in her special treasure box, under her bed. But secrets have a way of being discovered in houses where not everyone wishes each other well. Victoria found the wrapped necklace while Sophie was at her piano lesson with Mrs. Chen. Later that evening, when Sophie went to retrieve her gift, the treasure box was empty. Confused and increasingly worried, Sophie searched everywhere, her small heart beginning to race with panic. She found Victoria in the formal living room, examining the necklace with the same expression she might use when looking at something distasteful on the bottom of her shoe. "Looking for this?" Victoria asked, holding up the colorful creation. "Really, Sophie, I'm not sure why you're wasting time making trinkets when you should be focusing on your studies. This looks like something from a carnival prize booth." "Please give it back," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's for Maggie." "Maggie?" Victoria's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Oh, you mean Mrs. Thompson? Darling, you really must learn proper boundaries. She's an employee, not a family member. It's not appropriate for you to be giving her gifts." With that, Victoria opened her palm and let the necklace drop into the ornate wastebasket beside her chair. The soft thud of its landing felt like a physical blow to Sophie's small chest. "But I made it special," Sophie said, tears beginning to blur her vision. "Each color means something." "I'm sure it does, dear," Victoria replied dismissively, already turning her attention back to her magazine. "But you'll thank me later for teaching you appropriate social boundaries. Now run along and practice your scales. Your piano teacher says you're falling behind." That night, Sophie lay awake in her four-poster bed, staring at the ceiling and fighting back tears. Through the thin wall that separated her room from Margaret's small, adjoining quarters, she could hear the governess moving quietly about, preparing for bed. Sophie wanted desperately to tell Margaret what had happened, but something in Victoria's tone had frightened her into silence. The next morning brought news that made Sophie's world feel even smaller. Victoria appeared at breakfast with architectural plans spread across the marble kitchen island, her excitement barely contained. "I've been working with the most wonderful interior designer," Victoria announced to Richard, who had actually stayed for breakfast for once, though his attention remained divided between his coffee and his phone. "We're going to completely renovate the upstairs. Sophie's room will make a perfect walk-in closet for the master suite, and we can convert the governor's quarters into a home office." Sophie's fork clattered against her plate as the meaning of Victoria's words sank in. "Where will I sleep?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "Oh, darling, you'll have a lovely new room on the 3rd floor," Victoria said brightly. "Much more appropriate for a growing girl. And of course, we'll be making some staffing changes after the wedding. It's important to start our new life together with a fresh perspective." Margaret's face had gone pale, but she continued serving breakfast with steady hands, though Sophie noticed the slight tremor as she poured orange juice. Richard looked up from his phone long enough to nod vaguely at Victoria's plans before returning to his business call. "What kind of staffing changes?" Sophie asked, though she was already beginning to understand. Victoria's smile was radiant and terrible. "Well, we won't be needing a full-time governess anymore, will we? You're getting to be such a big girl. A few hours of tutoring each week should be quite sufficient." The words hit Sophie like ice water. Margaret would be leaving. The only person who had truly cared for her since her mother's passing would be gone, dismissed as casually as one might discard an old piece of furniture. That afternoon, while Victoria was out meeting with caterers about the upcoming engagement party, Sophie made a decision. She would make another necklace, a better one, and this time she would give it to Margaret immediately, before anyone could take it away. She worked with desperate intensity, her small fingers moving quickly through the beads she had hidden in various places around her room. This necklace would be perfect, each bead chosen with even more care than the first. She worked through lunch, through her afternoon tutoring session, and well into the evening, determined to complete her gift. As the house settled into nighttime quiet, Sophie crept down the hallway to Margaret's room, the finished necklace clutched carefully in her hands. She knocked softly on the door, and when Margaret appeared in her nightgown and robe, Sophie held out her creation with a mixture of pride and desperation. "I made this for you," Sophie whispered. "Please wear it always, so you won't forget me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she knelt down, to Sophie's level, accepting the necklace with trembling hands. "Oh, sweetheart, how could I ever forget you? This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me." She fastened the necklace around her neck immediately, the colorful beads catching the soft lamplight from her room. "I'll treasure this always, Sophie. No matter what happens, I'll always carry a piece of your love with me." For a few precious days, Margaret wore the necklace constantly, and Sophie felt a small measure of peace knowing that their connection was visible, tangible, real. But happiness, Sophie was learning, could be as fragile as the thin cord that held her beads together. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening, just as the family was finishing dinner. Victoria had noticed the necklace immediately upon her return from a day of wedding planning, but she had waited, watched, planned her moment with the calculated precision of a chess master. "Mrs. Thompson," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the formal dining room like a blade, "I couldn't help but notice your accessory." Margaret's hand instinctively went to the necklace at her throat. "It was a gift from Sophie." "How inappropriate," Victoria said, rising from her chair, with fluid grace. "I thought I had made it clear that personal gifts between staff and family members cross professional boundaries." Richard looked up from his dessert, finally paying attention to the conversation. Margaret stood as well, her chin raised with quiet dignity. "With respect, Miss Sterling, Sophie is a child who wanted to show kindness. I see no harm in accepting her gift." Victoria's laugh was sharp and cold. "No harm. Mrs. Thompson, you've clearly overstepped your position. It's obvious that you've been encouraging Sophie's attachment to you in ways that are frankly manipulative." "That's not true," Margaret said, firmly, though Sophie could see her hands beginning to shake. "I care for Sophie as any caregiver would." "Care for her?" Victoria's voice rose slightly, though she maintained her composure. "You've made her dependent on you in ways that are unhealthy for a child her age. This necklace is just evidence of how you've been encouraging inappropriate emotional attachment." Before anyone could react, Victoria stepped forward and grabbed the necklace from Margaret's throat, the cord snapping under the sudden pressure. Colourful beads scattered across the marble floor like tiny teardrops, rolling under furniture and into corners where they would never be recovered. Sophie's scream of anguish filled the dining room, a sound so raw and heartbroken that it seemed to echo off the crystal chandelier above. She dropped to her hands and knees, frantically trying to gather the scattered beads, her tears making it impossible to see clearly. "Look what you've done," Victoria said to Margaret, her voice now filled with righteous anger. "You've made this child hysterical over a worthless trinket. This is exactly what I mean about inappropriate boundaries." Richard finally stood, his face confused and troubled. "Victoria, perhaps that was a bit harsh." "Harsh?" Victoria turned to him, her green eyes flashing. "Richard, this woman has been manipulating your daughter, making her emotionally dependent in ways that aren't healthy. Can't you see how upset Sophie is? This kind of attachment isn't normal." Margaret knelt beside Sophie, helping her gather the scattered beads, her own tears falling silently. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm so very sorry." But even as they worked together to collect the broken pieces, Sophie could see the resolution forming in her father's eyes. He was believing Victoria's version of events, accepting her explanation that love was manipulation, that care was control. The next morning brought the inevitable consequence. Richard called Margaret into his study, and in his typically businesslike manner informed her that her services would no longer be required. He offered a generous severance package and a positive reference, delivered in the same tone he might use to conduct any other business transaction. Sophie watched from the top of the stairs as Margaret packed her few belongings, her movements slow and careful, as if she were trying to memorize every moment in this house that had become her home too. When Margaret paused at Sophie's bedroom door, looking in at the small girl who had pretended to be asleep, Sophie wanted desperately to run to her, to beg her not to leave, to promise she would be good if only Margaret would stay. But Victoria appeared at the end of the hallway, her presence like a cold shadow, and Margaret simply whispered, "Goodbye, my darling girl," and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the marble foyer below until the front door closed with a soft, final click. That night, Sophie lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence that had settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The mansion felt enormous and empty, despite being filled with expensive furniture and beautiful objects. None of it meant anything without the warm presence that had made it feel like home. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sophie made a decision that would have surprised the adults in her life with its quiet determination. If Margaret was gone, if the necklace was destroyed, if her room was to be taken away, then she would find another way to keep their connection alive. She would draw it, preserve it in the only way she knew how, even if she had to do it in secret. The battle for Sophie's heart was far from over, though the little girl didn't yet understand that some people fight for love while others fight for control, and that sometimes the difference between the two can determine the fate of a family. The days following Margaret's departure passed like frames in a silent movie. Sophie moved through the renovated mansion like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the new Persian rugs Victoria had installed throughout the house. The child who had once filled the halls with laughter and chatter now communicated only through nods and shakes of her head, her voice locked away somewhere deep inside where the pain couldn't reach it. Mrs. Patricia Hernandez, the new housekeeper Victoria had hired, was efficient and professional, but her interactions with Sophie remained strictly functional. She prepared meals according to the dietary plan Victoria had provided, maintained the house's pristine appearance, and ensured Sophie's schedule was followed to the minute. But when Sophie woke screaming from nightmares about scattered beads and empty hallways, Mrs. Hernandez simply suggested she drink some warm milk and try to sleep. Victoria seemed pleased with the new arrangement. "Children adapt quickly," she told her friend Cassandra during their weekly lunch at the Greenwich Country Club. "Sophie just needed some structure and appropriate boundaries. She's much better behaved now." What Victoria didn't mention was the collection of drawings she had found in Sophie's wastebasket. Page after page of coloured pencil sketches showing a small girl holding hands with a woman who looked remarkably like Margaret. Pictures of 3 figures standing together under a rainbow, of necklaces made from careful circles of colour, of rooms filled with warmth and light that looked nothing like the cold perfection of the current Wellington home. Victoria had thrown them all away without a second thought, just as she had disposed of the broken beads. But she hadn't found the drawings Sophie had hidden between her mattress and box spring, or the ones tucked inside her old picture books, or the sketch pad she kept hidden behind the loose board in her closet. Sophie's art became her voice, her only means of expressing the grief that threatened to swallow her whole. She drew Margaret reading stories, Margaret in the kitchen making pancakes, Margaret tucking her into bed and smoothing her hair back from her forehead. Each drawing was a memory preserved, a piece of love that Victoria couldn't take away. But as the weeks passed, the drawings began to change. The figures became smaller, more distant. The colours grew muted, then disappeared altogether. Sophie began drawing in stark black lines, images of empty rooms and single figures standing alone against vast white spaces. Richard noticed the change in his daughter, but attributed it to the normal adjustment period that Victoria assured him was to be expected. When he asked Sophie direct questions, she would simply stare at him with her mother's blue eyes and say nothing. He found her silence somehow easier to deal with than the constant chatter that had once required his attention and response. It was easier, that is, until the evening when everything began to unravel. Richard had come home early from a client dinner to find Victoria hosting her weekly bridge game in the formal living room. As he passed through the foyer, he heard his daughter's name mentioned in conversation and paused outside the doorway to listen. "The child barely speaks anymore," Victoria was saying to her friend Priscilla, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. "Much. More manageable than before, and after the wedding next month she'll be going to boarding school in Vermont. The Whitmore Academy has an excellent reputation for dealing with difficult children." "Boarding school?" Cassandra's voice rose with surprise. "But she's only 7 years old." Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive. "Sometimes early intervention is necessary. Besides, Richard and I need time to establish our own family dynamic without interference from his previous obligations." The word obligations hit Richard like a physical blow. His daughter, his only child, the last living piece of his beloved wife Elizabeth, had been reduced to an obligation in the mouth of the woman he planned to marry. "And if something were to happen," Victoria continued in a lower voice that Richard had to strain to hear, "well, accidents do occur at boarding schools. Children can be so careless, especially ones who are emotionally unstable." Richard felt ice water flow through his veins. The casual cruelty in Victoria's tone, the calculated way she spoke about his daughter's future, made him question everything he thought he knew about the woman he had chosen to build a life with. That night, after Victoria and her friends had left, Richard stood outside Sophie's bedroom door and listened to the silence within. No more bedtime stories read aloud, no more soft humming as she played with her toys, no more of the gentle sounds that had once made this house feel like a home. When he finally worked up the courage to enter, he found Sophie sitting at her small desk, drawing by the light of her bedside lamp. She didn't look up when he approached, but he could see she was working on another sketch of 3 figures holding hands, this one rendered in careful detail despite the late hour. "Sophie," he said softly, settling into the chair beside her desk. "Can we talk?" She continued drawing, adding delicate shading to the woman figure's hair, making it look remarkably like Margaret's soft grey curls. Her silence stretched between them like an ocean. "I know you miss Mrs. Thompson," Richard continued, his voice carefully gentle. "I've been thinking maybe I made a mistake letting her go." For the first time in weeks, Sophie's hand stilled on the paper. She didn't look at him, but he could see her small body tense with attention. "Victoria said that Mrs. Thompson was manipulating you, making you too dependent on her. But looking at you now, seeing how unhappy you are." He trailed off, struggling to find words for the growing realization that he had failed his daughter in the most fundamental way possible. Sophie set down her colored pencil and finally turned to look at him, her blue eyes filled with a pain so deep it made his chest tight. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. "She didn't manipulate me, Daddy. She loved me." The simple statement hit Richard with devastating clarity. Love and manipulation weren't the same thing at all. Margaret had loved Sophie the way Elizabeth would have wanted her to be loved, and he had thrown that gift away because Victoria had convinced him it was somehow harmful. "Tell me about the necklace," Richard said quietly. "The one you made for her." Sophie's face crumpled slightly as if the memory still caused physical pain. Each color meant something special, like the yellow ones were for her laugh, and the blue ones were for trust, and the pink ones were for love. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if finding the words was releasing something that had been trapped inside. "And Victoria destroyed it." Sophie nodded, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "She said it was inappropriate. She said Maggie wasn't family. But Maggie was the only one who really listened to me, who made me feel safe. She was more like a mom than anyone since—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Richard felt something crack open in his chest, a pain so sharp and clean it was almost relief. He had been moving through his life like a sleepwalker, letting Victoria make decisions about his daughter's future, because it was easier than facing his own grief and guilt over Elizabeth's passing. He had failed as a father, but it wasn't too late to change course. "Sophie, I want you to know that I'm going to fix this," he said, reaching out to touch her small hand. "I'm going to find Mrs. Thompson and ask her to come home. Will you help me?" For the first time in weeks, Sophie smiled, and the sight of it nearly broke his heart. "Really? You'll bring Maggie back?" "I promise," Richard said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The next morning, while Victoria was out wedding dress shopping, Richard began his search for Margaret Thompson. It proved more challenging than he had anticipated. Margaret had left no forwarding address, and his calls to her references went unreturned. Finally, he hired a private investigator, a discreet man named James Morrison, who specialized in finding people who preferred not to be found. It took Morrison 3 days to track down Margaret to a modest apartment complex in Stamford, about 20 minutes from Greenwich. When Richard arrived at her door on a grey Saturday morning, he found himself face to face with the woman who had cared for his daughter with more genuine love than he had shown in the past 2 years. Margaret's surprise at seeing him was evident, but she invited him in with the same gracious warmth she had always shown. Her small apartment was neat and comfortable, filled with books and photographs and a few plants that she was tending on the windowsill. It felt more like a home than his mansion had in months. "Mr. Wellington," Margaret said, settling into a worn armchair across from the sofa where she had gestured for him to sit. "To have to say this is unexpected." Richard found himself struggling to begin, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his mistakes and the humility required to acknowledge them. "Mrs. Thompson, Margaret, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." Margaret waited patiently, her hands folded in her lap, giving him the same attention she had always given Sophie when the little girl had something important to say. "I fired you based on accusations that I now realize were completely false," Richard continued. "Victoria convinced me that you were manipulating Sophie, encouraging an unhealthy attachment, but I can see now that what you gave my daughter wasn't manipulation. It was love. The kind of maternal love she's been missing since Elizabeth passed away." Margaret's eyes grew bright with unshed tears, but her expression remained composed. "How is Sophie?" she asked quietly. "Not good," Richard admitted. "She's barely spoken since you left. She's been drawing pictures of you, of the 3 of us together, trying to preserve the memories of when she was happy. I've failed her completely, and I don't know how to make it right." "You're making it right now," Margaret said gently, "by recognizing what happened and wanting to change it." Richard leaned forward, his voice urgent with sincerity. "I want you to come back, not as an employee, but as part of our family. Sophie needs you, and I need someone who actually cares about my daughter's well-being, instead of seeing her as an obstacle to overcome." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Wellington, I did receive another position offer this week, a family in Manhattan with twin boys. It would be a significant opportunity for me." Richard's heart sank, But before he could respond, Margaret continued, "However, there is nothing more important to me than Sophie's happiness and well-being. If you're truly committed to making changes, to being the father she needs, then yes, I would be honored to come home." The reunion between Margaret and Sophie was everything Richard had hoped it would be and more. When Margaret appeared at the front door of the Wellington mansion, Sophie's face transformed with joy so pure it seemed to light up the entire foyer. The little girl ran to Margaret with a cry of happiness, throwing her arms around the governess and holding on as if she would never let go. "I knew you'd come back," Sophie whispered into Margaret's shoulder. "I drew pictures of it happening, and I knew it would be real someday." "I never stopped thinking about you, darling girl," Margaret whispered back, her own tears flowing freely now. "Not for a single moment." Victoria's reaction to Margaret's return was swift and predictable. She arrived home from her shopping expedition to find Margaret unpacking in her old quarters and Sophie chattering excitedly as she helped arrange books on the shelves. "What is the meaning of this?" Victoria demanded, her voice sharp with outrage. "Richard, I thought we had settled this matter." Richard appeared in the doorway of Margaret's room, his expression calm but determined. "We need to talk, Victoria. Privately." The conversation that followed was brief and decisive. Richard confronted Victoria about her plans for boarding school, her cruel comments about Sophie being an obligation, and most importantly, about the way she had systematically tried to destroy the relationship between Sophie and the only person who had provided genuine maternal care since Elizabeth's passing. Victoria's response was exactly what Richard had expected. She denied nothing, instead doubling down on her position that Sophie was spoiled and difficult, that Margaret was unprofessional and manipulative, and that Richard was making a huge mistake by prioritizing his daughter over his fiancée. "You'll regret this," Victoria said as she gathered her belongings, her composure finally cracking to reveal the calculating coldness beneath. "Sophie is a damaged child who will never be anything but a burden. You're choosing her over our future together." "Yes," Richard said simply. "I am. And that's exactly as it should be." After Victoria's departure, the house began to transform once again. Margaret resumed her gentle routines with Sophie, but this time Richard joined them. He began coming home earlier, sharing meals with his daughter, asking about her day and actually listening to her answers. He learned about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, her love of drawing, and her secret fear that everyone she loved would eventually leave her. To address that fear, and to symbolize their new beginning, Sophie had an idea. She would make 3 new necklaces, one for each member of their redefined family. This time she chose the colors with even more care, selecting shades that represented not just love and trust but also resilience and hope. The necklace she made for Margaret was a beautiful pattern of warm earth tones representing stability and nurturing. Her father's necklace incorporated strong blues and deep greens, colors of protection and growth. Her own necklace was a rainbow of bright, cheerful colors that spoke of joy and possibility. On the day they all wore their necklaces together for the first time, Sophie stood in the garden behind the house and took a photograph with Margaret's old camera, wanting to preserve this moment forever. In the picture, all 3 of them are smiling genuine smiles, their colorful necklaces catching the afternoon sunlight, their faces reflecting the peace that comes from being truly understood and loved. 6 months later, Richard surprised them both by suggesting they take the trip to the ocean that Sophie had been dreaming about since she was 5 years old. They spent a week in a beach house on Cape Cod, building sandcastles and collecting shells, and watching Sophie experience the joy of running barefoot through the surf. Margaret was no longer just their housekeeper or governess. She was family in every way that mattered. Richard had legal papers drawn up granting her guardianship rights in case anything happened to him, ensuring that Sophie would never again face the uncertainty of losing the maternal figure who had become so central to her life. The mansion in Greenwich was still beautiful, but now it felt alive with warmth and laughter. The walls displayed Sophie's artwork proudly, her drawings no longer hidden but celebrated as expressions of her creative spirit. The kitchen was once again the heart of the home, filled with the sense of Margaret's cooking and the sounds of a family that had found its way back to each other. On quiet evenings, when Sophie was working on her homework at the kitchen table and Margaret was preparing dinner while humming softly. Richard would sometimes pause in the doorway and marvel at the simple perfection of the scene. This was what family looked like, not perfect, not without challenges, but real and loving and beautifully, authentically theirs. The beaded necklaces they all wore had become more than just accessories. They were symbols of connection, reminders of love that survived even the darkest moments, proof that some bonds are too strong to be broken by those who don't understand their true value.